The people who worked the floor that night do not agree on how long it lasted. The camera operator said 8 seconds. The stage manager said 15. The woman who translated it, the only person in the building hearing both languages at once, always refused to put a number on it. What none of them ever disagreed about was that the network pulled it, quietly and completely, before most of the country ever knew it had happened. The show taped in a mid-sized studio in Burbank in the spring of 1972, the kind of building that looked unremarkable from the parking lot and became something else entirely once the lights came up and the audience filed in. It ran live to the eastern half of the country and on a delay to the west, which is a detail that would matter more that night than it ever had before. The format was familiar to everyone watching. A monologue, a first guest with something to promote, a second segment built around whatever the producers thought would hold a restless late-night audience through the last half hour. That week, the producers thought they had found it. Her name was Anong, and she was 26 years old, and in her own country she was not obscure at all. She had held a national Muay Thai title, had beaten fighters from 4 other countries in matches the sporting press, back home, covered the way American papers covered heavyweight boxing. Outside of that world, she was completely unknown, which was exactly why a producer who had been reading about the sport in a martial arts magazine thought she would make good television, something visual, something Americans had never seen. A woman who could do things with her elbows and shins that the studio audience would not quite believe. She spoke almost no English, so the show hired an interpreter, a Thai-American woman who sat just off camera and would turn the host's questions into Thai and the champion's answers back into English. What the producers had not told her was that there would be a second guest in the same segment. He had been on the show once before, briefly, and the audience response had been the strongest the staff had logged in 2 years. Getting him back had taken months. He had agreed on a single condition, that he would not be announced ahead of time, that he would come out as a surprise because it made for better television. The host knew, the floor crew knew, the interpreter knew, the audience did not. And the champion, sitting under the lights explaining her sport to a country that had never heard of it, did not either. That was the part that mattered. If you want to understand why a routine cultural segment turned into something the network buried, stay with this, because it turned on a single question, and the question was hers, not his. She was good on camera in a way no one had rehearsed. Asked how her sport differed from others, she answered through the interpreter in short, direct sentences. 8 points of contact, she said, where most arts used 2 or 4. Fists, elbows, knees, shins. She said her sport was built for real fighting rather than forms or demonstration, and that the difference was conditioning, the training to take damage as well as give it. She stood and threw 3 elbows into the air, each one snapping clean, and the audience made the sound audiences make when they realize a small person is more dangerous than they assumed. The host, delighted, asked her the question that producers had probably hoped she would be asked. How did her art compare to something like Kung Fu, in terms of what actually worked? Through the interpreter, she said they were very different. She said she had great respect for tradition, but that she had never seen a Kung Fu demonstration that showed her anything she needed to worry about. There was a ripple of laughter, polite and a little uncertain. The host smiled, let it sit for a beat, and then said he happened to have someone backstage who might see it differently. He turned to the camera and said the name. The curtain moved. What the audience did in the next few seconds was not the noise a crowd makes for a famous man. It was quieter and stranger than that. A wave of recognition that started at the back of the room and rolled forward as people understood what they were seeing and turned to tell the person beside them. He walked out in a dark suit, unhurried, and took the empty chair beside her end of the couch. He nodded to the host. He looked at the champion and gave her a small, easy smile that said hello and nothing else. She looked at the interpreter. The interpreter leaned in and said his name in Thai, and the crew members, close enough to see the champion's face later, agreed on what they saw cross it, not awe, assessment. The host wasted no time. He said the champion had been making a case for her art over Kung Fu, and he wanted the new guest's reaction. The man in the dark suit did not reach for a rebuttal. He said she was not wrong. He said Muay Thai conditioning was real, that it produced genuinely tough fighters, that he respected it. The interpreter relayed it. The champion listened and gave a single neutral nod. The host, sensing the segment might resolve too politely, leaned in and said, "But." The man in the suit smiled and said he had not said but. The audience laughed. Even the champion's expression moved slightly, not into a smile, but toward one. Then the host asked the direct question: was the 8-weapon system, the conditioning, an advantage over a style like his? The man in the suit said every style had something worth learning, and that this was actually the point he would make. He said if you only ever trained inside one system, you could only read opponents who moved inside that system, and everyone else became difficult to see. The more systems you understood, the more you could see. The interpreter turned it into Thai. The champion listened, and then she said something, and the interpreter's delivery of it changed the temperature of the room. She had asked how many Muay Thai fighters he had actually fought, not in a film. The audience made a sound that was not a laugh. It was the sound a room makes when something sharp has been said and everyone is waiting to see where it lands. The two of them were not hostile. That was what the crew kept coming back to afterward. Neither of them was performing anger. But they had stopped being strangers making conversation and become two people testing the exact edge of something, and the host, 30 years into reading rooms for a living, shifted in his chair in a way the floor crew had learned to watch for. The man in the suit said he had trained with Muay Thai fighters, that he had sparred with them. The champion answered before the interpreter finished, and the interpreter caught up a beat behind. Sparring in a gym was not a real fight. She had been in real fights since she was 14. She meant no disrespect, she said, but she had never met a kung fu fighter she believed she could not handle. He said that was fair, that experience was the only real teacher. And she looked at him and said, through the interpreter, that he was being polite, and that polite was fine, but she wanted to know whether he believed what he was saying or was only being careful because this was television. For a moment he did not answer. If you want to know what he said and what she did when he said it, stay with this because it is the part the eastern half of the country saw live and the western half never did. He looked at her and she looked back at him, and the crew nearest the couch said she was not playing a character. She was asking the only way she knew how to ask, directly and without decoration. He said he believed what he was saying. The interpreter relayed it. And the champion said one short word in Thai, and the interpreter said it in English, and it was the word the whole night turned on. She said, "Prove it." She stood. Not in a threatening way, and not for the cameras. She stood the way a fighter stands, when a conversation has reached the point where conversation is no longer the right instrument. Her hands coming up slightly, not into a stance, just into ready. The host said, in a very controlled voice, that they should keep this a demonstration. She was not listening to the host. She said something to the interpreter, without taking her eyes off the man in the suit. And the interpreter, whose voice had climbed slightly, said the champion wanted to show him the speed difference, that she would throw a technique and would like to see him respond. The man in the suit had not moved from the couch. His hands were still in his lap. He looked at her standing over him with 12 years of training visible in the way her weight was balanced, and he said calmly to tell her he understood. She threw an elbow, and she did not throw it slowly. The people who were closest are the ones who insist on this detail, because it is the one that makes the rest of it mean anything. It was a real technique at real speed, the short-range elbow built to end things in close quarters, and it was thrown with genuine intent. It did not end anything, because the man it was aimed at was no longer in the chair. He had not stood and had not stepped back. He had simply ceased to be in the place the elbow was traveling toward, and he was on his feet, now a half step to the left of it, and his hand was resting against her forearm. Light contact, the kind that is both a stop and a redirection, that costs the person applying it almost nothing, and costs the other person the entire momentum they have committed. The elbow finished its arc in empty air. The studio went silent. The whole exchange had taken about a second. She looked at her own arm at the place his hand had touched and already left, and then she looked at him, and her face was not angry. It was the face of someone receiving information she had not expected and processing it in real time. She reset, and she was fast, genuinely fast, converting the elbow into the knee that was supposed to follow it. He moved inside the knee rather than away from it, too close for the strike to find its range, and from that inside position he did something with his hands that the crew could not fully see but could read from the result, which was her balance leaving her for half a second before she caught it. She caught it. She was good enough to catch it, but catching it had cost her the sequence, and she knew it, and she reset again, breathing harder now. She threw a roundhouse kick, the shin technique that is among the most damaging in her sport when it lands, and it did not land. He slipped it, moving just enough to be on the outside of it where the power was not, and from there his open hand touched her shoulder. 2 fingers, barely weight at all. She sat down on the floor, one knee to the carpet, one hand catching herself. She was not hurt. Everyone who was there is insistent on that, because it is the thing that separates what happened from what it could have looked like. Nothing had landed hard enough to hurt her. Her balance had simply been taken in a direction she had not chosen, and the floor was where that ended. He was already crouching before she had fully registered it, bringing himself down to her level rather than standing over her, and he extended his hand, not a showman's gesture. A hand offered to help someone up. She looked at it, and she took it, and he brought her to her feet, and she was steady at once, because whatever had removed her balance had been brief and surgical, and was already over. They stood facing each other, and the audience was making a sound no one on the crew had heard a studio audience make, something that combined a cheer and a gasp with a third thing that happens when 400 people watch something that does not fit any category they brought with them. And then the champion did the thing that everyone who tells this story says people never expect. She laughed, not a polite laugh, a real one, short and surprised, the laugh of someone who has just met something genuinely funny because it was genuinely unexpected. She said something to the air, not to the interpreter, and the interpreter relayed it quietly. She said she had not felt him move. He looked at her and said she was very fast, and that the knee had been real, that he had almost not had the angle. The interpreter turned it into Thai. The champion listened and answered, and the interpreter said, "She says almost is the most interesting word you have used all night." And the room finally released, 400 people laughing at once because they had been holding something in their chests for 90 seconds and now had somewhere to put it. That was the natural end of the segment. The host leaned back, looked at the ceiling for a moment, and found the exact sentence that made an unplanned thing feel as though it had been heading that way all along. He said he had been doing the show a long time, and that this was the most interesting conversation the couch had ever held. The champion, when he asked if she was all right, said through the interpreter that she was fine, that she had been hit far harder, but that she had never been moved by someone she could not feel moving. Then the 2 guests sat back down, and she sat beside him without anyone telling her to, and for a few minutes they simply talked, through the interpreter, about position and toughness, 2 people working out what had just passed between them, while an audience applauded around them, and neither of them performed for it. If you want to know why almost none of the country got to see this, stay with this, because the decision was made during the commercial break that followed, a few feet from where it had happened. A senior producer came onto the floor and found the man who had booked the segment. The crew member coiling cable nearby heard most of it. The exchange could not air, the senior man said. An unscripted physical altercation between 2 guests. The booker said no one had been hurt, that it was a demonstration, that it was exactly what the segment had been about. The senior man said she had thrown a real technique, that it had not been planned, that standards would come down on all of them. The booker was quiet for a moment, and then said he knew. The Eastern feed had already gone out live to something like 12 million people. The Western feed had not. They could cut it there. They cut it there. The western half of the country saw the conversation up to the moment the champion said, "Prove it," and then a clean transition to commercial, as though the segment had simply ended on a strong line. The floor, the hand, the laugh, the long exchange afterward, all of it was gone. The switchboard lit up during the break with calls from the east, not angry ones, people asking what they had just seen and whether it was real and when they could see it again. They never could. The tape of the full segment was pulled from the archive within the week, and the internal notes gave the reason as a production decision, which is the phrase institutions use when someone has decided something and does not intend to explain it. The part that almost never gets told happened after the lights were down, in a corridor outside the green rooms, with the audience gone and the cameras dark and the interpreter no longer between them. The two of them nearly walked into each other on their way out. They stopped, about the same distance apart as they had been on the stage. There was no one to translate. The champion said something in Thai, not quite to him, maybe to herself. The man in the dark suit looked at her and said, in English, that he knew. She looked at him for a moment as if deciding whether to believe he had understood her without translation. Then she nodded once, the kind of nod that costs something and means it, and he nodded back, and she walked out first, and he followed a half-minute later, and the corridor was quiet again. The crew member who overheard it never learned what she said. He asked the interpreter the next day, and she had already gone. He asked around for years in the loose way you ask about a thing you cannot quite let go of, and no one could tell him. His best guess, decades on, was that it had something to do with not feeling him move, because that was the thing she had kept returning to all night. For a fighter who had spent 12 years able to locate every opponent she faced, who had described it as reading a map, the experience of standing across from someone who was not on the map at all was not a small thing, and it was not something she seemed willing to pretend had not happened simply because there were cameras. And when she said whatever she said, in an empty hallway with no one to carry it across, the man in the dark suit had answered, "I know." He would be gone within 2 years, 32 years old, and the country would spend the decades after trying to describe what it had lost and never quite managing it, because the description kept coming out smaller than the thing itself. Somewhere there may still be a copy of what aired to the east that night. 11 seconds a network decided the rest of the country should not see. The people who were in the room have spent their lives describing it to anyone who would listen, always carefully, always in the lowered voice people use for a thing they know sounds impossible, but watched happen with their own eyes.